A coma is said to be one of the worst things that can happen to a person. It is a state of unconsciousness where a person is unresponsive and cannot be woken, but can hear voices and sounds around them. A coma can last from days to weeks, months, and sometimes years. Join us today as we look at the 15 most shocking coma stories that are definitely going to leave you speechless. Number 15. The survival story of Victoria Arlen. Victoria Arlen was born with her brothers as triplets and was a very happy and hopeful kid who enjoyed dancing and was very gifted at sports. Victoria was living a normal life like kids of her age when something happened and her life took a dramatic turn. When she was 11 years old, she began feeling flu-like symptoms and started passing out multiple times. Her health got worse, and at one point, unfortunately, even her family was not able to help her. Extreme inflammation of her brain and spinal cord was ruining her life, and as a result of her condition, she became paralyzed from the waist down. Over time, she completely lost the ability to speak. No one understood what was happening to her. While everyone was trying to figure out what was happening, Victoria slipped into a coma. For 2 years, doctors worked continuously to try and figure out what had caused her coma. Finally, they discovered that she had an autoimmune condition called transverse myelitis, a disease that attacks the spinal cord and can cause paralysis to different extents. The doctor informed Victoria's family that if there is no improvement within 3 to 6 months of the onset of the disease, the chances of her recovery will be very unlikely. According to Victoria, she woke up from her coma before her body fully woke up from it. She regained consciousness but could not move or communicate with anyone. She could hear everything that people were saying around her, but had no way of telling them that she was at least partially awake. The 13-year-old tried to talk to them and couldn't understand why they couldn't hear her. It wasn't until later that she realized that the words she thought she was saying out loud, she was only saying in her head. Victoria soon realized that though she could see, she could only look in the direction that her head was pointing. She was completely unable to move her body, including her neck. Victoria heard conversations between 2 doctors judging her parents for thinking she would recover. Despite the doctors' pessimistic view, Victoria's parents and brothers remained faithful, and they hoped their little girl would wake up one day. Victoria lived trapped inside her body like that for an entire year. Then finally, in the winter of 2009, she made eye contact with her mum. Her mum asked her to blink twice if she was really there. Thankfully, Victoria was able to do so. Her mum calls this their Christmas miracle. It was the sign they needed to prove to the doctors that their daughter was not lost forever. That moment, that eye contact changed everything. Her recovery began happening much more quickly, and eventually she was able to go home. Bit by bit, she began gaining control over her body again. She began physical therapy and speech therapy. Victoria had to relearn how to do even basic things like holding up her head again. The next year, though in a wheelchair and still unable to eat food, she was able to return to school. 6 years after initially becoming sick, when Victoria was 17, she won 3 silver medals and a gold medal in the London 2012 Paralympic Games and set a world record in the 100-meter freestyle event. With faith and constant hard work, Victoria turned her life around and became an inspiration for the world. Number 14. ABBA's Mamma Mia. In April 2009, 3 years old Layla Towsey developed a rash on her leg and started being sick. When her mum picked her up, she didn't recognize her and had a really high temperature. She was taken to Queen's Hospital, Romford, where doctors initially thought it was probably just a heat rash. But Layla had become delirious, so her mother insisted on more checks. Within hours, Layla had a heart attack and was transferred to St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington, West London, and put on life support. Before she was in the ambulance, her family was told to kiss her goodbye, which was an awful moment for her loved ones. Layla was diagnosed with meningitis B and meningococcal septicemia and spent the next 5 days in a coma in intensive care. While doctors didn't have much hope for the young girl, her mother was preparing herself to keep her on life support in order to keep her breathing. But everyone was surprised when Layla began singing Mamma Mia, having seen the film starring Meryl Streep. Within a few days, Layla was taken off life support and was breathing on her own. While how the little girl came out of the coma may seem shocking, she did make a good recovery, and for her mother, it was nothing less than a miracle. Layla made a full recovery and was only left with scarring on her legs from the blood poisoning. She will always be remembered as a meningitis girl in a coma who woke up singing ABBA's Mamma Mia. Number 13. Aussie Ben McMahon. Ben McMahon was involved in a serious car accident in 2013 which left him in a coma for more than a week. When he awoke, to the astonishment of his family, the Melbourne man started speaking in Mandarin and was unable to speak his native tongue, English. Ben wasn't a total stranger to Mandarin and had previously studied it in high school and been on a trip to China, but he was never fluent in the language. The first person Ben saw was a nurse of Asian appearance, so he said to her in Mandarin, "Hi, it really hurts here. What happened to me?" At that time, his thoughts and dreams were also in Mandarin. English was like an alien language to him at the time. His parents even considered learning the Asian language to communicate with their son. While it is not fully understood what happened to Ben during the injury, one possibility is the areas of Ben's brain where he learned his native language were damaged, but the areas where he learned his second language were not. This meant that access to his additional language was better than to his native language. It was reported in the media that he later wrote a note to a nurse in Mandarin saying, "I love my mum, I love my dad, I will recover." It is understood Ben took 2 or 3 more days to recall how to speak English. He has since gone on to study in Shanghai and now stars as a Chinese game show host called You Are the One. He found love with Feng Guo, a Chinese-Australian lawyer who also speaks Mandarin. Although Ben insists he was never fluent in the Mandarin he learned at school, the doctors believe all the words he used when he woke from the coma were ones to which he would have been previously exposed. Mandarin Chinese is one of the most difficult languages to learn, but somehow Ben magically picked it up during a nap, which is very fascinating. Number 12. The Real-Life Sleeping Beauty. The story of Sarah Scantlin is fascinating to many as she was able to awake from a coma after 20 years. What is most amazing is the dedication and patience of her family and best friend. In 1984, Sarah was hit by a drunk driver who fled the scene. She was walking to her car with her friend, Laurie Shockley. Laurie was unharmed, but Sarah sustained a traumatic brain injury and spinal cord damage. For 20 years, Sarah lived in a minimally responsive state of consciousness. Sarah's family and Laurie visited her for 20 years, and they remained loyal and always felt devastated by her condition. But in 2004, Sarah surprised her family and best friend when she began speaking. No one was prepared for that, especially since they had visited her for 20 years with no response. Sarah had minimal activity during that time. She stared blankly and could not communicate. She made some improvements when she cried out at one time and she could follow someone with her eyes, but that was the extent of it. She was well cared for at Golden Plains Healthcare Centre, now at Devicey Care of Hutchinson. When Sarah was able to communicate and see those around her, she commented about how old everyone looked. After all, she went into a coma when she was a freshman in college. Her best friend Laurie put makeup on her and they talked. Sarah was disabled, but she was able to go outside in a wheelchair and see her surroundings. Her long-term memory was preserved, and she was able to recall events in her life. She remembered her school and teachers. The staff at the healthcare center helped Sarah with speech therapy, forming words and adding emotion, physical therapy, and occupational therapy. Eventually, she was able to feed herself. Her family and her friend Laurie enjoyed lots of fun times. They drove around and visited old friends and Sarah's previous high school. Mostly, they laughed and enjoyed every moment with Sarah. On May 20th, 2016, Sarah Scantlin died at 50 years old. But she did live a life worth remembering, even after 20 years of her life were taken away from her. Number 11. A Visit to the Other Side. Trace's story is also quite extraordinary. After a near-fatal accident in June 2014, the comedian spent time in a coma and suffered various injuries. Morgan spoke with Oprah about his experience and said he went to heaven and met his late father, Jimmy Morgan Sr. The 47-year-old has spent years recovering from traumatic brain injury as well as broken bones. Tracy said his father gave him some advice and he told him that he was a fighter and had to return to his little girl and wife. Maven was just a newborn when Morgan nearly died in the truck crash that placed him in a 2-week coma and took the life of his friend, fellow comic James McNair. His baby girl gave him a reason to fight for his life while he was in critical condition, and because of the motivation to see her again, Morgan was able to fight death. Morgan claimed that he met his late father and had a conversation with God, where God told him that his room wasn't ready yet, and that he had something planned for Morgan that he had to do. According to the comedian, since the accident, something has been different about him, and he believes he will never be exactly the same again. The former SNL star is doing well, and he embarked on his comedy tour Picking Up the Pieces, which wrapped up in 2016. Number 10. Waking up to a changed Poland. In 1988, a Polish rail worker, Jan Grzebski, fell into a coma after an accident. His story is remarkable in more ways than one. Initially, Jan was only given 2 to 3 years to live after it was discovered that he had cancer. Despite his diagnosis, Jan lived in his comatose state for 2 decades. When he went to sleep, Poland was communist, food was rationed, and people waited in line for gas. But he woke up to democracy and a free market economy. His wife, Gertrude, was always convinced that he could recover someday and continued taking him to family events and talking with him normally all this time. She looked after Jan for 19 years and never lost hope of his recovery. While Jan can vaguely recall some of their interactions, most of the things from his coma are a blur. For 19 years, Jan did not move or say anything. He tried to say things, but they couldn't be understood, so sometimes his family and friends pretended they understood. When Jan woke up, he was amazed to see the colorful streets and the goods, and according to him, the world was prettier now than it was 19 years ago when Poland was still under communist rule. Doctors had not expected Grzebski to survive, let alone emerge from the coma, but with the hopes and prayers of his wife, he did, and he woke up to have 11 grandchildren and conditions of his country far better than they were 19 years ago. Number 9. Birth during a coma. Emma Miners, who was 23, was rushed to a hospital after falling unconscious with pneumonia and suffering 2 strokes. 2 weeks into the coma, she began to go into labor prematurely at 29 weeks. Nurses carrying out a routine examination of Miners noticed that she was delivering a child. When Emma woke up a month later, she discovered that she had given birth to a beautiful baby girl. When I woke up from my coma, the nurses kept showing me photographs of this baby girl, and I had no idea who she was. Miners had no recollection of being pregnant, though she remembered being married and having a son. Nurses at the hospital didn't even realize Emma was in labor until the baby's head emerged. Her daughter, Amy, was a miracle baby who weighed only 3.5 pounds. It's amazing to think how Amy came into the world. Even when I was unconscious, my body knew what to do. I'd love to be able to remember giving birth to her, but I'm just grateful that we are both alive and healthy now, Emma said in an interview. According to a spokesperson for Colchester General Hospital, it is extremely unusual for a woman in Emma's circumstances to deliver normally without needing a cesarean section. But Emma delivered a beautiful baby girl while she was unconscious, and both the mother and the daughter survived. Number 8. Frat Party Knockout. 19-year-old collegiate beauty Emily Rand of Rutgers University landed in a coma during a frat party. Who knew partying was such a dangerous sport? According to the witnesses, Emily threw the first punch and a male partygoer retaliated. When he punched Emily, she fell to the ground, hitting her head. It was all caught on Snapchat. Ms. Rand suffered a concussion, a fractured skull, and a brain bleed, eventually leading to a coma. Friends of Emily said that the males were calling them obscene names and their friend went to defend them. After investigating the video, police decided not to file charges, stating that both parties had some responsibility for her injury. After having surgery to relieve pressure on her brain and being in the hospital and rehabilitation center, Emily fully recovered, but this was something very sad that happened to the young girl. Number 7. The addicted 3-year-old. Chinese 3-year-old Ya Wen was in a horrific traffic accident. The toddler spent 5 days in a coma after being hit by a speeding van. When she woke up, her mother said her personality was dramatically different and she began acting like an adult. Her mother caught her hiding in the bathroom, smoking her father's cigarettes. She had seen cigarette butts in the toilet but assumed they belonged to her husband. A local store owner had begun giving the toddler cigs on credit, assuming she wanted them for her father. Her father gave up smoking to set a good example but claims the toddler still cries for them. If that wasn't enough, the little girl likes to drink beer too. Her mum says she can down up to 3 glasses with no problem. This is definitely something very strange to see in a toddler. Number 6. Conversion to Islam. A Catholic priest, Eduardo Vincenzo Maria Gomez from Spain, who woke up from a 17-month-long coma, converted to Islam after he claimed Allah spoke to him and showed him the beauty of the heavens. 87-year-old Father Gomez lived and preached on the island of Java in Indonesia for over 43 years, was fluent in Javanese and various dialects of different ethnic groups that made up the island, and was a well-respected figure amongst religious groups of the area. The priest was reported to have suffered a cardiac arrest while fixing the roof of his church along with other volunteers, falling 2 stories high, but he managed to survive. He came out of his 17-month coma as a religiously changed man. The priest stated that he knew nothing of Islam and had never read the Quran, but God spoke to him and asked him to follow him to the heavens, and the holy light shone through his entire being, and beheld the golden gates of heaven appeared before him, and God told him his name, and it was Allah. The man miraculously suffered no spinal injury and, after some exercise, was able to walk. His followers were surprised, though many followed him in his conversion. They said they trusted Father Eduardo and did not want to be misled on Judgment Day. Eduardo Vincenzo Maria Gomez has already ordered a new mosque to be built on the island and is preaching Islam to the people on the island. Number 5. Matt Davis. Matthew Davis and his wife Danielle had only been married for 7 months when something tragic happened. While riding his motorcycle, Matthew was hit by a car, sending him straight to the hospital and into a coma. After examining his situation, his doctor told Danielle that about 90% of patients with the same injury don't survive. He said if it were him, he'd pull the plug, but the loving wife refused to take that as truth. Deciding that taking him home became the only option, Danielle took care of her husband without professional aid, but she never gave up, and after 3 months her prayers were answered when Matthew woke up from his coma. It was bittersweet for Danielle, however. Matthew survived against all odds, but all memories of his wife and his life before the accident vanished due to brain damage. That realization hurt Danielle, but it never broke their spirits. Danielle was 24 at the time of the accident. She started dating Matt, who was then 23, only 2 months before their wedding. When the hospital sent Matt home, Danielle took care of her husband. Danielle moved back into her mother's house, and they helped care for Matt, who remained in a coma for 3 months. After he woke up, he started following them with his eyes and began communicating. Matt has made amazing progress in the time that has passed since the accident. He was in a rehabilitation program where he learned to walk again. But he struggled to regain his long-term memory and was unable to remember Danielle from before the crash. However, the couple survived the hard times together and stayed with each other through thick and thin. Number 4. Miracle of the Coma Woman. The real-life story of Annie Shapiro, who fell into a coma at age 50 in 1963, is more remarkable than the movie based on her miraculous reawakening. When she suddenly woke nearly 30 years later in 1992, she was a 79-year-old granny, devastated by her appearance and the way the world had changed. She could not believe that her husband Martin was an old man of 81 and that her teenage son and 25-year-old daughter Marilyn were middle-aged. She was awestruck to learn about cordless telephones and spaceship flights. The talented businesswoman who had run 2 apron shops near Toronto, Canada before her illness, fell into a coma on November 22, 1963, aged 50. She was watching news reports on the assassination of US President John F. Kennedy on a black-and-white TV set when she suffered a massive stroke. For the next 2 years, Mrs. Shapiro was totally paralyzed, with her eyes staring wide open. Her husband would put drops in her eyes every few hours to keep them from drying out. Mr. Shapiro, who was a steel foundry worker, dressed and fed her like a totally helpless child. After 2 years of physical therapy, he finally got her to the point where she could sit up and walk assisted on either side. She could not see but could eat simple food. During her long sleep, Mrs. Shapiro's body began breaking down. She had cataract surgery, a hysterectomy, and a hip replacement. But amazingly, on October 14, 1992, she suddenly snapped out of her coma, and her husband was very surprised. When she first looked in the mirror, she wanted to die, then she cried over all those lost years. The most touching part of the miracle was the renewed romance between Shapiro and her husband, who had cared for her all those years, refusing to have her placed in a nursing home. Although Mrs. Shapiro lost some precious years of her life, in the end, she was able to spend time with her loved ones. Number 3. Rom Hauben. For 23 years, Rom Hauben was imprisoned in his own body. He saw his doctors and nurses as they visited him during their daily rounds. He listened to the conversations of his carers. He heard his mother deliver the news to him that his father had died, but he could do nothing. He was unable to communicate with his doctors or family. He could not move his head or weep. He could only listen. Doctors presumed he was vegetative after a near-fatal car crash in 1983. They believed he could feel nothing and hear nothing for 23 years. Then a neurologist, Stephen Lores, who decided to take a radical look at the state of diagnosed coma patients, released him from his torture. Using a state-of-the-art scanning system, Lores found to his amazement that his brain was functioning almost normally. With the help of therapy, Rom learned to communicate via computer. The discovery of Mr. Hauben's consciousness led to doctors re-examining over a dozen patients who could be suffering the same fate and could be helped. Number 2. Back from 27 years of coma. A woman from the United Arab Emirates who was seriously injured in a traffic accident in 1991 made a seemingly miraculous recovery after emerging from a 27-year-long coma. Munira Abdullah, who was aged 32 at the time of the accident, suffered a severe brain injury after the car she was traveling in collided with a bus on the way to pick up her son from school. Omar Weber, who was then just 4 years old, was sitting in the back of the vehicle with her but was left unscathed as his mother cradled him in her arms moments before the accident. She was declared to be in a vegetative state, unresponsive but able to sense pain. She lived and was moved to various medical facilities with her son and was fed through a tube that kept her alive. She underwent physiotherapy to ensure her muscles would not weaken through lack of movement. In 2017, the family was offered a grant by the Crown Prince's Court, a government body in Abu Dhabi, for Ms. Abdullah to be transferred to Germany. There she underwent a number of surgeries to correct her severely shortened arm and leg muscles, and she was given medication to improve her state, including her wakefulness. While everyone was hopeless, her son was not, and he prayed day and night for her recovery. There are only a few cases of people recovering consciousness after several years, and even then, recovery can be protracted, but Munira Abdullah made it out safely and reunited with her son. Number 1. Martin Pistorius. It was the late 80s, and young Martin Pistorius, growing up in South Africa, was mostly thinking about electronics, resistors, and transistors. But at age 12, his life took an unexpected turn. He came down with a strange illness. The doctors weren't sure what it was, but their best guess was cryptococcal meningitis. He got progressively worse. Eventually, he lost his ability to move by himself, his ability to make eye contact, and then finally, his ability to speak. His parents were told he was as good as not there, a vegetable. The hospital told them to take him home and keep him comfortable until he died. But he didn't die. Martin just kept going, according to his mother. His father would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, get him dressed, load him in the car, and take him to the special care center where he'd leave him. 8 hours later, he would pick him up, bathe him, feed him, put him in bed, and set his alarm for 2 hours so that he'd wake up to turn him so that he didn't get bed sores. And that was their lives for 12 years. He began to wake up when he was 14 or 15 years old. Though he was aware of everything just like any normal person, he couldn't move his body. He was a vegetable for everyone, but then one day he decided he'd had enough. He wanted to gain some small measure of control over his day. So he figured out how to tell time by how the sun moved across a room. That was the start. Eventually, Martin found a way to reframe even the ugliest thoughts that haunted him. And slowly, as his mind felt better, something else happened. His body began to get better too. It involved inexplicable neurological developments and a painstaking battle to prove that he existed. And after years of struggle, he was able to slide out of the coma and make everyone knew he existed.